Hello, my name is Brant Hunt. My channel is Discerning What is True. I'm going to be reading from Gerald Massey, that's Massey lecture, that is chapter 1. The historical, that is the Jewish Jesus, and the mystical, the Egyptian Christ. Today, the day is the 13th day of January 2024. So thank you for being here. And we're going to go get into this particular work by Gerald Massey. And let's change this real quick here. So it's the historical Jesus or the Jewish Jesus and the mythical, or what we call the Egyptian Christ. In presenting my readers with some of the data which shows that much of the Christian history was pre-extant as Egyptian mythology, I have to ask you to bear in mind that the facts, like other foundations, have been buried out of sight for thousands of years in a hieroglyphic language that was never really read by Greeks or Romans and could not be read until the last clue was discovered by Champollion. He's a Frenchman, almost the other day. This was in the 1800s. I think it's the late 1800s. In this way, the original source of our mythology and Christology remain as hidden as those of the Nile until the century in which we live. The mystical matter enshrouded in this language was sacred, entrusted to the keeping of the buried dead who have faithfully preserved it as their book of life, which was placed beneath their pillows or clasped to their bosoms. Sorry, I'm just looking here. In their bosoms, in their coffins, and their tombs. Secondly, although I am able to read the hieroglyphics, nothing offered to you is based on my translation. I work too warily for that. The transcription and literal rendering of the hieroglyph texts herein employed are by scholars of indisputable authority. There is no loophole of escape that way. I lectured upon the subject of Jesus many years ago. At that time, I did not know how we had been misled, or that the Christian scheme, quote, as it is aptly called in the New Testament, is a fraud, founded on a fable in the Old. I then accepted the canonic Gospels as containing a verifiable or variable human history and assumed, as others do, that the history proved itself. Finding that Jesus, or Jehoram ben Pandariah, was a historical character known to the Talmud, I made the common mistake of supposing that this proved the personal existence of the Jesus found portrayed in the canonic Gospels. But after you have heard my story and weighed the evidence now for the first time collected and presented to the public, you will not wonder that I should have changed my views or that I should be impelled to tell the truth to others, as it is now appears to myself, although I am only able to summarize here in the briefest manner possible a few of the facts that I have dealt with exhaustively elsewhere. The personal existence of Jesus as Ben Perdario or Pandaro can be established beyond a doubt. One account affirms that, according to a genuine Jewish tradition, that man, who is not to be named, was a disciple of Jehoshaphat ben Peratiah. It also says he, quote, he was born in the 4th year of the reign of the Jewish king Alexander Jannaeus, notwithstanding the assertions of his fathers that he was born in the reign of Herod. That would be more than a century earlier than the date of birth assigned to the Jesus of the Gospels. But it can be further shown that Jehoshaphat may have been born considerably earlier even than the year 102 BC. although the point is not as much consequences here. Jehoshaphat, the son of Parachia, was a president of the Sanhedrin, the fifth, reckoning from Ezra as the first one of those who in the line of descent received and transmitted the oral law, as it was said, direct from Sinai. There cannot be two of that name. This Ben Parachia has begun to teach as a rabbi in the year 154 BC. We may therefore reckon that he was not born later than 180 to 170 BC, and that could hardly be later than 100 BC when he went down to Egypt with his pupil, or it is related that he fled there in consequence of a persecution of the rabbis, feasibly conjectured to refer to the civil war in which the Pharisees revolted against King Alexander Janarius, and consequently about 105 BC. If we put the age of his pupil, that is Jehoshaphat ben Pandero, at 15 years old, that would give us an approximate date extracted without pressure, which shows that Jehoshaphat ben Pandero may have been born about the year 120 BC. But 20 years are a matter of a little moment here. According to the Babylonian gematria, I'm sorry, not gematria, Gemaria to the Mishah of Trak, Shabah, this Jehovah, the son of Pandera and Stada, was stoned to death as a wizard in the city of Lud, L-U-D, or Lydda, L-Y-D-D-A, and afterwards crucified by being hanged on a tree on the eve of the Passover. This is a matter of death assigned to Jesus in the book of Acts. The Gemari says there exists a tradition that on the rest day before the Sabbath they crucified Jehoshaphat on the rest day of the Pascha, that is the day before the Passover, the year of his death. However, it is not given in that account, but there are reasons for thinking it could not have been much earlier nor later than BC 70, because this Jewish king, Janarius, reigned from the year 106 to 79 BC. He was succeeded in the government by his widow, Salome, Salome, whom the Greeks called Alexandria, and who reigned for some 9 years. Now, the traditions, especially of the first Tadoya Jehoshaphat, relate that the queen of Janarius and the mother of Herodias, who must therefore be Salome, in spite of her being called by another name, showed favor to Jehoshaphat and his teachings, that she was a witness of his wonderful works and powers of healing, and tried to save him from the hands of the Sacerdotal enemies, because he was related to her. But that during her reign, which ended in the year 71 BC, he was put to death. The Jewish writers and rabbis with whom I have talked about denied the identity of the Talmudic Jehoshaphat and the Jesus of the Gospels. Quote, this, observes Rabbi Jahilias, quote, which has been related to Jehoshaphat ben Parachia and his people, contains no reference whatsoever to him whom the Christians honor as God, end quote. Another rabbi, Salmon Zebai, produced 10 reasons for concluding that the Jehoshaphat, the Talmud, was not he who was after called Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus of Nazareth, quote, and of the canonic Gospels was unknown to Justus, to the Jew of Celius, and to Josephus, the supposed reference to him by the letter being an undoubted forgery. The blasphemous writings of the Jews about Jesus, as Justin Martyr calls him, always refer to Hoshea ben Perdaro and not to the Jesus of the Gospel. It is Ben Perdaro they mean when they say they have another and a truer account of the birth and life, the wonder worker and the death of Jehoshaphat or Jesus. This repudiation is perfectly honest and sounded base. The only Jesus known to the Jews was Jehoshaphat ben Perdaro, who had learned the arts of magic in Egypt and who was put to death by them as a sorcerer. This was likewise the only Jesus known to Celsius, the writer of the, quote, true Logos, quote, a work which the Christians managed to get rid of bodily with so many others of the anti-Christian evidence. Celsius observes that he was not a pure word, not a true Logos, but a man who had learned the arts of sorcery in Egypt. So in the Clementines, it is the character of Ben Pandario that Jesus is said to rise again as the magician. But here is the conclusive fact. The Jews know nothing of Jesus, the Christ of the Gospels, as a historical character, and when the Christians of the 4th century trace his pedigree by the hand of Ephatimus, they are forced to derive their Jesus from Pandaria. Epipius gives the genealogy of the canonic Jesus in this wise, being Jacob, either called Pandaria, Mary, Joseph, Cleopas, and Jesus. This proves that in the 4th century the pedigree of Jesus was traced to Pandaria, the father of that Jehoshaphat, who was the pupil of Ben Parachia, and who becomes one of the magicians in Egypt, and who was crucified as a magician on the eve of the Passover by the Jews in the time of Queen Alexandria, who has ceased to reign in the year 70 BC. The Jesus, therefore, who lived and died more than a century too soon. Thus, the Jews do not identify Jehoshaphat ben Badaria with the gospel of Jesus, or whom his supposedly contemporaries know nothing, but protest against the assumption as an impossibility, whereas the Christians do identify their Jesus as a descendant of Pandaria. It was he or nobody, yet he was neither the son of Joseph nor the Virgin Mary, nor was he crucified in Jerusalem. It is not the Jews, then, but the Christians who fuse two supposedly historical characters into one. There being but one history of knowledges or known or either side, it follows that the Jesus of the Gospels is the Jehoshaphat of the Talmud, or is it not at all, as a person? This shifts the historical basis altogether. It antedates the human history by more than 100 years, and it is at once destroyed the historical character of the Gospels, together with that of any other person of Jesus than Ben Padaria. In short, the Jewish history of the matter will be found to corroborate the mythical. As Epiphanius knew of no other historical Jesus than descendant of Pandaria, it is possible that this is the Jesus who tradition is reported by Irenaeus. Irenaeus was born in the early part of the 2nd century between 120 and 140 AD. He was a bishop of Lyons, France, and a personal acquaintance of Polycarp. Another Polycarp is one of the early church fathers. Okay, so this is what we call the patristic era in church history, and he repeats a tradition testified to by the elders, which he alleges was directly derived from John, the disciple of the Lord. Quote, to the effect that Jesus was not crucified at 33 years of age, but that he passed through every age and lived on to be a oldish man. Now, according with the dates given, Jehoshaphat ben Badaria may have been between 50 and 60 years old age when he was put to death, and his tradition alone first furnishes a clue to the neotheistic statement of Irenaeus. When the true tradition of Ben Padaria is recovered, it showed that he was the sole historical Jesus who was hung on a tree by the Jews, nor crucified in the Roman fashion, and authenticates the claim now to be made on behalf of the astronomical allegory to the dispensational Jesus, the chronic Christ, the mythical Messiah of the canonic Gospels, and the Jesus of Paul, who was not the carnalized Christ, for I hold that the Jesus of the other Gospel, according to the apostles Cephalus and James, who was utterly repudiated by Paul, was none other than Ben Padaria, the Nazarene, of whom James was a follower, according to a comment on him found in the book of Abdolizuria. Anyway, there are two Jesuses, or Jesus and the Christ, one of whom is repudiated by Paul. But Jehoshua, the son of Padaria, can never be converted into Jesus Christ, the son of a virgin mother, as a historical character, nor can the dates given ever be reconciled with contemporary history. The historical Herod, who sought to slay the young child Jesus, is known to have died 4 years before the date of the Christian era, assigned for the birth of Jesus. So much for the historical Jesus, and now for the mythical Christ. Here we can tread on the firmer ground, that is, the mythical Messiah was always born of the Virgin Virgin Mother, a factor unknown in natural phenomenon, and one that cannot be historically one that can only be explained by means of the mythos and those conditions of primitive sociology which are mirrored in mythology and preserved in theology. The Virgin Mother has been represented in Egypt by the maiden queen Mun-em-Yul, the future mother of Amenhotep III, some 16 centuries BC, who impersonates the eternal virgin that produced the eternal child. 4 consecutive scenes reproduced in my book are found portrayed upon the innermost walls of the Holy of Holies in the Temple of Luxor, which was built by Amenhotep III, a pharaoh of the 17th dynasty. The first scene on the left hand shows the god Tot, the lunar Mercury, the annunciator of the gods, in the act of hailing the Virgin Queen and announcing to her that she is to give birth to the coming son. In the next scene, the god kept in conjunction with Hathor gives the new life. This is the Holy Ghost or Spirit that causes the Immaculate Conception. Yep, being the Spirit by name in Egyptian, the natural effects are made apparent in the virgin swelling form. Next, the mother is seated on the midwife's stool, and the newborn child is supported in the hands of one of the nurses. The fourth scene is that of adoration. Here, the child is enthroned, receives homage from the gods, and gifts from men. Behind the deity kept on the night, 3 spirits, the 3 magi, or kings of the legend, are kneeling and offering presents with their right hand and life with their left. The child thus announces, incarnated, born, and worshipped, was the pharaonic representative of Aten's son, S-U-N, in Egypt, the god Adon of Syria, and Hebrew Adonaniah, the child Christ of Atum Kop. The miraculous conception of the ever Virgin Mother, personated by Mun-em-Yul, as mother of the only one and representative of the divine mother of the youthful sun god. These scenes, which were mythical in Egypt, have been copied or reproduced as historical in the canonic Gospels, where they stand like 4 cornerstones to the historical structure and prove that the foundations are mythical. Jesus was not only born of the mythical motherhood, his descent on the maternal side, in trace in accordance with the origins of the mythical Christ. The Virgin was also called the harlot because she represented the pre-monogamic stage of intercourse, and Jesus descended from 4 forms of the harlot, that is, Thamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, each of whom is a form of the stranger in Israel and is not a Hebrew woman. Such history, however, does not show that illicit intercourse was the natural mode of the divine descent, nor does it imply unparalleled human prodigies. It only proves the mythos in human sociology. The son of the mother preceded the father as son of the woman who was a mother but not a wife. This character is likewise claimed for Jesus, who is made to declare that he was earlier than Abraham, who was the typical great father of the Jews. Whether considered to be mythical or historical, Jesus states emphatically that he existed before Abraham was. This is only possible to the mythical Christ, who preceded the Father as Son of the Virgin Mother, and we shall find it so throughout. All that is non-natural and impossible as human history is possible, natural, and explicitly as mythos. It can be explained by mythos because it originated in that which alone accounts for for it comes to this at last. The more hidden the meaning of the gospel history, the more satisfactory it is explained by the mythos, and the more mystical the Christian doctrine, the more easily can it be proved to be mythical. The birth of Christ is astronomical. The birthday is determined by the full moon of Easter. This can only occur once every 19 years, as we have illustrated by the epoch or golden number of the prayer book. Understand me, Jesus the Christ can only have a birthday or resurrection once in 19 years, according with the Metonic cycle, because his parents are the sun and moon, and those appear in the earliest known representations of the man upon the cross. So you see what they're talking about here. These are all based upon astrological signs here, you see. And his birthday occurs every 19 years. That's what he's stating. This proves the astronomical and non-human nature of the birth itself, which is identical with that of the full moon of Easter in Egypt. Cassini, the French astronomer, has demonstrated the fact that the date assigned for the birth of the Christ is astronomically epoch in which the middle conjunction of the moon with the sun happened on the 24th day of March at 1:30 in the morning at the meridian of Jerusalem, the very day of the middle equinox. The following day, that is the 25th, was the day of the incarnation, according to Augustine, but the date of the birth, according to Clement and Alexander. For 2 birthdays are assigned to Jesus by the church fathers, or Christian fathers, one at the winter solstice, the other at the vernal equinox. These, which cannot both be historical, are based on 2 birthdays of the double Horus in Egypt. Plutarch tells us that Isis was delivered of Horus, the child, about the time of the winter solstice, and the festival of the second or adult Horus followed the vernal equinox. Hence, the solstice and spring equinox were both assigned to the one birth of Jesus by the Christolaters. And again, that is which is impossible on human history is the natural fact in relation to the 2 Horuses, the dual form of the solar god in Egypt. And here, in passing, we may point out the astronomical nature of the crucifixion. The gospel, according to John, brings on a tradition so different from that of the synopsis as to invalidate the human history of both. The synopsis says that Jesus was crucified on the 15th day of the month Nisan, N-I-S-A-N. John affirms that it was on the 14th month. This seriously rift runs through the very foundation. As human history, it cannot be explained, but there is an explanation possible, which, if accepted, proves the mythos. The crucifixion, that is, or crossing, was and still is determined by the full moon of Easter. This is the lunar reckoning would be on the 14th of the month of the 28 days. In the solar month of 30 days, it would be reckoned as occurred to the 15th of the month. Both unite, and rift closes in proving the crucifixion to have been an astronomical just in Egypt, where the 2 dates can be identified. Plutarch also tells us how the Mithratic cult has been particularly established in Rome about the year 70 BC, and Mithras was fabled as having been born in a cave. Wherever Mithras was worshipped, the cave was consecrated as his birthplace. The cave can be identified, and the birth of the Messiah is that cave, no matter under what name he was born, can be definitely dated. That is, the cave of Mithras was the birthplace of the sun in the winter solstice, when this occurred on the 25th day of December in the sign of the sea goat, and the vernal equinox in the sign of the ram. Now, the Akkadian name of the 10th month, that of the sea goat, which answers roughly to our December, the 10th by name is Abu Uda, that is the cave of light, the cave of rebirth for the sun, S-U-N, in the lowest depths of at the solstice, figure as the cave of light. This cave was continued as the birthplace of the Christ. You will find it in all Gospels of the infancy, and Justin Martyr states or says, quote, Christ was born in the stable, and afterwards took refuge in the cave, end quote. He likewise vouches for the fact that Christ was born on the same day that the sun, S-U-N, was reborn in, I don't know how to pronounce this, I'm going to say it, I may butcher it here, Stabulum Agadun, or in the stable of August, A-U-G-I-E-S, August. Now, the cleaning of this stable was the 6th labor of Hercules, his first being in the sign of the lion. And Justin was right. The stable and the cave are both figured in the same celestial sign. But mark this, the cave was the birthplace of the solar Messiah from the year 2410 to the year 255 BC, at which later date the solstice passed out of the sea goat into the sign of the archer. and no Messiah, whether called Mithras, Adon, Tammuz, Horus, or Christ, could have been born in the cave of Abba, Uriah, on the stable, or the stable of August and the 25th day of December after the year 255 BC. Therefore, Justin has nothing but the tradition of the bygone birthday to prove the birth of the historical Christ 255 years later. In their mysteries, the Sacraments celebrate the birth of the babe in the cave or subterranean sanctuary from which the priests issue and cried, quote, "The virgin has brought forth the light, is about to begin to grow again," end quote. On the mother night of the year, and the Saracenia were not supporters of historical Christianity. The birthplace of the Egyptian Messiah at the venerable equinox was figured in Ap or Apta, the corner, but Apta is also the name of the crib and the manger. Hence, the child born in Apta was said to be born in a manger, and this Apta or crib or manger is the hieroglyphic sign of the solar birthplace. Hence, the Egyptians exhibit the babe in the crib or manger in the streets of Alexandria. Their birthplace was indicated by the color of the equinox as it passed from sign to sign. It was also pointed out by the star in the east when the birthplace was in the sign of the bull. Orion was the star that rose in the east to tell where the young sun God was reborn. Hence, it is called the star of Horus, end quote. That was then the star of the, quote, three kings, end quote, who greeted the babe. For the three kings is still a name of the three stars in Orion's belt. Here we learn that the legend of the three kings is at least 6,000 years old. In the course of procession about 255 BC, the venerable birthplace passed into the sign of the fishes, and the Messiah, who had been represented for 2,155 years by the ram or lamb, and previously for other 2,155 years by the Apis bull, was now imagined as the fish or the fishman, called Ithaca in Greek. The original fishman, the ant of Egypt, and the Alm of Chaldea probably dates from the previous cycle of procession of basically around 26,000 years earlier, at about 255 BC. The Messiah, as the fishman, was to come up once more in the manifestor from the celestial waters. The coming Messiah is called Dag, D-A-G. The fish in the Talmud, and the Jews at one time connected his coming with some conjunction or concurrence in the sign of the fishes. This shows that the Jews were not only in possession of the astronomical allegory, but also the tradition by which it could be interpreted. It was the mythical and Chronian Messiah alone who was or could be the subject of prophecy that might be fulfilled. Prophecy that was fulfilled, as it is in the book of Revelation, when the equinox entered the cross, was re-erected, and the foundation of a new heaven were laid in the sign of the ram 2410 BC, and again when the equinox entered the sign of the fishes in 255 BC. Prophecies that will be again fulfilled when the equinox enters the sign of the waterman about the end of this century, to which the Samaritans are still looking forward for the coming of their Messiah, who has not yet arrived for them. The Christians alone ate the oyster. The Jews and Samaritans only got an equal share of the empty shells. The uninstructed Jews, the Ididins, at one time thought the prophecy, which was astronomical and solely related to the cycles of time, was to have its fulfillment in human history, but they found out their error and bequeathed it unexplained to the still more ignorant Christians. The same tradition of the coming one is also extant among the millenarians and Adventists. As among the Muslims, it is traditional of El Mahdi, the prophet who is come in the last days of the world to conquer all the world, and who was lately descended to Sudan with the old announcement, the day of the Lord is at hand, which shows that the astronomical allegory has left some relics of the true traditions among the Arabs, who were at one time learned in astronomical lore. The Messiah, or as the fishman, is foreseen by Esdras, ascending out of the sea as the same whom God the highest had kept a great season, which by his own self shall deliver the creature. The ancient fishman only came up out of the sea to converse with men and teach them in the daytime. Quote, when the sun set, end quote, says Herodias. Quote, it was the custom of this being to plunge again into the sea and abide all day in the deep, end quote. So the man foreseen by Esdras is only visible by day. As it is said, so can no man upon earth see my son on those that be with him, but in the daytime, end quote. This is parodic or fulfilled in the account of Itius, the fish, the Christ, who instructs men by day, but retires to the lake of Galilee, where he demonstrates his solar nature by walking the water at night or at dawn of day. See, these are stories. These are myths. They're sharing these things. They're not literal. We are told that his disciples being on board a ship, quote, when even was come in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went in unto them walking upon the sea, end quote. Now the fourth watch began at 3 o'clock and ended at 6 o'clock. Therefore, this was about the proper time for a solar god to appear walking upon the water, or coming up out of them as the Ones. Ones is said to have taken no food while he was with men. Quote, in the daytime he used to converse with men, but took no food at that season, end quote. When his disciples prayed him, saying, Master, eat, end quote, said unto them, another quote here, I have meat to eat that you know not of. My meat is to do the will of him that sent me, end quote. This is a perfect likeness of the character of Onus, who took no food, but whose time was wholly spent in teaching men. Moreover, the mythical fish man is made to identify himself. When the Pharisees sought a sign from heaven, Jesus said, there shall no sign be given but the sign of Jonas. For as Jonas become a sign unto the Ninevites, so shall also the Son of Man be to this generation. End quote. So the sign of Jonas is that of the On, or fishman of Nineveh, whether we take it direct from the monuments or from the Hebrew history of Jonah, or from the zodiac. The voice of the secret wisdom here says truly that those who are looking for signs can have no other than that of the returning fishman, Onus, Ithis, or Jonah, and assuredly there was no other sign or date that those of Ithacus the fish, who was reborn of the fish goddess Ator Gedis in the sign of the fishes, 255 BC, after whom the primitive Christians were called little fishes. This date of 255 BC was the time of the date of birth, or the rebirth of the celestial Christ, and there was no valid reason for changing the time of the world. The Gospels contain a confusing record of early Christian belief, things most truly believed, that is, in Luke, concerning certain mythical matters, which were ignorantly mistaken for human and historical. The Jesus of our Gospels is but little of a human reality, in spite of all attempts to naturalize the mythical Christ and make the story look rational. The Christian religion was not founded on a man, but as a divinity, that is, a mythical character. So far from being derived from the monoman, the typical Christ was made up from the features of various gods after a fashion somewhat like those, quote, pictorial averages, end quote, portrayed by Mr. Galton, Galton, in which the traits of several persons are photographed and fused in a portrait of a dozen different persons, merged into one that is not anybody. And as fast as the composite Christ falls to pieces, each picture is claimed, each character is gathered up by the original owner, as with the grasp of gravitation. It is not I that denied the divinity of Jesus Christ. I asserted he never was and never could be any other than a divinity, that is, a character non-human and entirely mythical, who has been the pagan divinity of various pagan myths that had been pagan during the thousands of years before our era. Nothing is more certain, according to honest evidence, that the Christian scheme of redemption is founded on a fable misinterpreted that the prophecy of fulfillment was solely astronomical, and the coming one as the Christ who came in the end of the age or of the world was by a metaphorical figure, a type of time from the first which never could take form in historical personality, any more than time and person could come out of a clock case when the hour strikes. That no Jesus could become a Nazarene by being born at or taken to Nazareth, and that the history in our Gospels is from beginning to end the identifiable story of the Son God, S-U-N, and the Gnostic Christ, who never could be made flesh. When we did not know the one, it was possible to believe the other. But when once we truly know, then the false belief is no longer possible. Mythical Messiah was Horus in the Osirian mythos, Har-Kuti in the Typhonian. Krusun is that of Amon-Ra and is the cult of Antum-Ra, and the Christ of the Gospels is the amalgam of all these characters. Christ is the Good Shepherd. So was Horus. Christ is the Lamb of God. So was Horus. Christ is the bread of life. So was Horus. Christ is the truth and the life. So was Horus. Christ is the fan bearer. So was Horus. Christ is the Lord. So was Horus. Christ is the way and the door of life. Horus was the path by which they travel out of the sepulchre. He is the God whose name is written with the hieroglyphic sign of the road or way. Jesus is he that should come, and it. And what is that? Ayu, the root of the name in Egyptian, means to come. I am Hep at the Su, the son of Atum, or Plot, was the ever-coming one, who is always portrayed as the marching youngster in the act and attitude of coming. Horus included both sex, that is, the child or the soul is of either sex, and potentiality of both. Hence the Hermaphrodite deity, and Jesus in Revelation is the young man who has the female paps. Help signifies he who comes with peace. This is a character in which Jesus is announced by the angels, and when Jesus comes to his disciples after the resurrection, it is as the bringer of peace. Quote, learn of me and you shall find rest, end quote, says the Christ. Krun Su Neheb is the good rest, peace in person. The Egyptian Jesus Ayum Hep was the second Atom. Paul's Jesus is the second Adam in one rendition of Jesus' gospel instead of the only begotten Son of God. A variant reading gives the only begotten God, which has been declared as impossible rendering, but the only begotten quote was a special type in Egyptian mythology, and the phrase re-identifies a divinity whose embryo is the beetle. Hor Apollo says, quote, to denote the only begotten or a father, the Egyptians delineate a scarabaeus, end quote. By this, they symbolize a only begotten because the creature is self-produced, being unconceived by a female, end quote. Now, the youthful manifestor of the beetle god was this, Lumahel, the Egyptian Jesus. The very phraseology of John is common to the inscriptions which tell of him who was the beginning of becoming from the first, and who made all things, but who himself was not made. I quote verbatim. And not only was I the beetle god, and to continue in the only begotten God, quote, the beetle type was also brought on a symbol of the Christ. Ambrose and Augustine, among the church fathers, or Christian fathers, as to say, identified Jesus with as the good Scalabarus, end quote, which further identifies the Jesus of John's Gospel with the Jesus of Egypt, who was the ever-coming one and the bringer of peace, which I have elsewhere shown to be the Jesus to whom the book of Ecclesiastes is inscribed and ascribed in the Apocrypha. And according with this, a continuation of the Kamite symbol, it was also maintained by some sectors that Jesus was a potter and not a carpenter. And the fact is that the only begotten beetle-God, who's portrayed sitting in the potter's wheel, forming the egg or shaping the vast symbol of creation was the potter personified as well as the only begotten God in Egypt. The character and teaching of the canonic Christ are composed of contradictions which cannot be harmonized as those of a human being, whereas they are always true to the mythos. He is the Prince of Peace, and yet he asserts that he came not to bring peace. I came not to send peace, I came not, I came not to send peace, but a sword, end quote. And not only is Lum Help, the bringer of peace by name in one character, he is the sword personified in the other. In this he says, quote, I am the living image of Atum, proceeding from him as a sword, end quote. Both characters belong to the mythical Messiah in the ritual, who also calls himself the, quote, the great destroyer, the great disturber, and the great tranquilizer, end quote, the God contention, end quote, and the God peace, end quote. The Christ of the canonic Gospels has several prototypes, I should say, and sometimes the copy is derived or the trait is caught from one original and sometimes from the other. The Christ of Luke's Gospel has a character entirely distinct from that of John's Gospel. Here he is the great exorciser and caster out of demons. You see, remember the story of that? When the guy had the demons within him. He was a madman, so to speak. Quote, had devils this long time, end quote. No child possessed with a devil. No blind and dumb man possessed with a devil. Other miracles are performed by the Christ of John, but not these, because John is a different type of the Christ, and the original of the great healer in Luke's Gospel may be found in the god Karamusu, who was the divine healer, the supreme one among all the other healers and saviors, especially as the caster out of demons and the expeller of possessing spirits. He's called in text the great, quote, great God, the driver away of possession, end quote. In the state of the possessed princes, this god in his effigy is seen for by the chief of Bactum, that he may come and cast out a possessing spirit from the king's daughter, who has an evil movement in her limbs. The demon recognizes divinity just as the devil recognizes Jesus, the expeller of evil spirits. Also, the god Kursun is lord over the pig, a type of Sut. He is portrayed in the disk of the full moon of Easter in the act of offering the pig as a sacrifice. Moreover, in judgment scenes, when the wicked spirits are condemned and sent back into the abyss, their mode of return to the lake of primordial matter is by entering the bodies of swine. Says Horus to the gods, speaking of the condemned one, when I sent him in his place he went, and he has been transformed into a black pig, end quote. So when the exorcist in Luke's Gospel casts out legion, the devils ask permission of the Lord of the pig to be allowed to enter the swine, and he gives them leave. This and much more, this might be adduced, tends to differentiate the Christ of Luke and to identify him with Krasun, rather than with Help, the Egyptian Jesus, who is reproduced in the Gospel according to John. In this way, it can be proved that the history of Christ in the Gospels is one long and complete catalog of likenesses to the mythical Messiah, the solar or lunar solar god. The litany of Ra, quote, for example, is addressed to the sun god in a variety of characters, many of which are assigned to the Christ in the Gospels. Ra is the supreme power, the beetle that rests in the empty realm, who is born at his own sun. This is already said, it is the God in John's Gospel who says, quote, I and the Father are one, end quote. And who is the Father born as his own son? For he says, in knowing and seeing the Son, quote, from henceforth you know him and have seen him, end quote. That is, i.e., the Father. Ra is designated the, quote, soul that speaks, end quote. Christ is the word. Ra is the destroyer of venom. Jesus said, venom. Jesus says, in my name they shall take up serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them, end quote. In one character, Ra is the outcast. So Jesus had not where to lay his, he had nowhere to lay his head. Ra is the timid one who sheds tears in the form of the afflicted. He's called Remi, the weeper. This weeping god passes through Rem, end quote, the place of weeping, and there conquers on behalf of his fathers. In the ritual, the god says, quote, I have desolated the place of Rem, end quote. This character is sustained by Jesus in the mourning over Jerusalem that was to be desolated. The words of John, quote, Jesus wept, end quote, are like a cherubim statue of the afflicted one, quote. As Remi the weeper, Ra is also the god who, quote, makes the mummy come forth, end quote. Jesus makes the mummy come forth in the shape of Lazarus. And in the Roman catacombs, the risen Lazarus is not only represented as a mummy, but in an Egyptian mummy which has been eviscerated and swapped for the eternal abode. Ross says to the mummy, quote, come forth, and Jesus cries, quote, Lazarus, come forth. Ra manifests as the, quote, the burning one who has sent destruction, end quote, or sends his fire into the place of destruction, end quote. Also, quote, he sends fire upon the rebels, end quote. His form is that of the, quote, God of the furnace, quote. Christ also comes in the person of this, quote, burning one, end quote, the center of destruction by fire. He is proclaimed by Matthew to be the baptizer with fire, he says, quote, I am come to send fire on the earth, end quote. He is portrayed as, quote, God of the furnace, which shall, quote, burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire, end quote. He is to cast the rebellious into the, quote, furnace of fire and send the condemned ones into everlasting fire. All this was natural when applied to the solar god and is supposed to become supernatural when misapplied to a supposed human being to whom it never could apply. The solar fire was the primary African fount of theological hellfire and hell. So you see, these are some things, you see how these words come from other places. The, quote, litany of Ra collects the manifold characters that make up the total God, term Teb, Tim, and the Gospels have gathered up the mythical remains, thus the result in each one identical or entirely similar. From beginning to end, the canonic Gospels contain the drama of the mysteries of the lunar, L-U-N-I, lunate, solar God, narrated as a human history. The scene on the Mount Transfiguration is obviously derived from the ascent of Osiris into the Mount of Transfiguration in the moon. The sixth day was celebrated as that of the change and transformation of the solar god in the lunar orb, which he re-entered on that day as a regenerator of his light. With this, we may compare the statement made by Matthew with that is, quote, after 6 days, Jesus went up into the high mountain apart, and he was transfigured, and his face did shine as the sun, S-U-N, of course, and his garments became, quote, white as the light. In Egypt, the year began soon after the summer solstice, when the sun descended from his midsummer height, lost his force, and lessened in its size, I should say. This represents Osiris, who was born of the Virgin Mother as his child Horus, the diminished infantile son, S-U-N, of autumn, the suffering, quote, wounded, bleeding Messiah, as he was represented. He descended into hell or Hades, where he was transformed into the violet Horus and rose again as the son of the resurrection at Easter. In these two characters of Horus on the two horizons, Osiris furnishes the dual type for the canonic Christ, which shows very satisfactorily how the mythical prescribes the boundaries beyond which the historical does not, dare not go. The first was a child Horus, who always remained a child. In Egypt, the boy or girl wore the Horus lot of childhood until 12 years of age. Thus, childhood ended about the 12th year. But although adultship was then entered upon by the youth, and the transformation of the boy into manhood began, the full adultship was not attained until 30 years of age. The man of 30 years old was the typical adult. The age of adultship was 30 years, as it was in Rome under Lex Papii, P-A-P-P-I-A. The Homothete is the man whose years are triad by tens, and who is Krim. As with the man, so it is with the god. And the second Horus, the same god in the second character, is the Krimen, or Krim Horus, the typical adult of 30 years. The god up to 12 years was Horus, the child of Isis. the mother child, the weakling. The Virat Horus, that is the son in its Virat strength, the adult of 30 years, was representative of the fatherhood, and this Horus is the anointed son of Osiris. These two characters of Horus the child and Horus the adult of 30 years are reproduced in the only two phases of the life of Jesus in the gospel. John furnishes no historical data for the time when the quote, the Word was incarnated and became flesh, nor for the childhood of Jesus, nor for the transformation into the Messiah. But Luke tells us that the child of 12 years was the wonderful youth and that he increased in wisdom and stature. This is the length of years assigned to Horus the child. And this phase of the child Christ life is followed by the baptism and anointing. The descent of the pubescent spirit with the consecration of the Messiah at Jordan, when Jesus, quote, began to be about 30 years of age. The earliest anointing was the consecration of puberty, and here at the full age of the typical adult, the Christ, who was previously a child, the child of the Virgin Mother, is suddenly made into the Messiah as the Lord anointed. And just as the second Horus was regenerated and this time begotten of the Father, so in the transformation scene of the baptism in Jordan. The Father authenticates the change into full adultship with the voice from heaven saying, quote, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased," end quote. The spirit of puberty, or the Rael, being represented by the descending dove called the Spirit of God. Thus, from the time when the child Christ was about 12 years old age until that of the typical Homophade of Egypt, which was the age assigned to Horus when he became the adult god, there is no history. This is exact, according with the Kamite allegory of the double Horus, and the mythos alone will account for the chasm, which is wide and deep enough to engulf a supposed history of 18 years. So that's why we don't have any information at all from basically from 12 years old when he goes to Egypt to 30. Childhood cannot be carried beyond the 12th year, and the child Horus always remained a child, just as the child Christ does in Italy and the German folk tales. The mythical record founded on nature went no further, and there the history consequently halted within the prescribed links to begin with anointed and regenerate Christ at the age of Krim Horus, the adult of 30 years. And these two characters of Horus necessitates a double form of the mother who divides into the two divine sisters, Isis and Nephthys. Jesus also was bimater, or mater, M-A-T-E, or dual mothered. And the two sisters reappeared in the Gospels of the two Marys, both of whom are the mothers of Jesus. This again, which is impossible as human history, is perfect according to the mythos that explains it. As the child Horus, Osiris comes down to earth. He enters matter and becomes mortal. He is born like the Logos, or as, quote, as a word. His father is Sept, the earth, whose consort is Nun, the heaven, one of whose name is Mithrit, Merit, M-E-R-I, sorry, the Lady of Heaven. And these two are the prototypes of Joseph and Mary. He is said to cross the earth, a substitute, and to suffer vicariously as the Savior, Redeemer, and Justifier of men. In these two characters, there was constant conflict between Osiris and Typhon, the evil power, or Horus and Sut, the Egyptian Satan. As the autumn equinox, the devil of darkness begins to dominate. This was the Egyptian Judas, who betrayed Osiris to his death at the Last Supper on the day of the great battle of the Mysical equinox. Osiris conquered as the ascending god, the Lord of the growing light. Both these struggles are portrayed in the Gospels. In the one, Jesus is betrayed to his death by Judas. In the other, he rises superior to Satan. The latter conflict followed immediately after the baptism. In this way, When the sun was halfway round from the line sign, it crossed the river of the waterman, the Egyptian land, Lartana, Hebrew Jordan, Greek Eridamus, I should say. Is this water? In this water, I should say, the baptism occurred, and the transformation of the child Horus was into the viral adult. The conqueror of the evil power took place. Horus becomes hawk-headed, that is, just where the dove ascended and abode on Jesus. Both birds represent the violet, and that constitutes the anointed one at puberty. But by this added power, Horus banishes Sut, and Jesus overcomes Satan. Both the baptism and the contest are referred to in the ritual. That is, quote, I am washed with the same water in which the good opener, that is, on Nefer, washes when they disputed with Satan. That justification should be made to on Nefer, the word made true, end quote, or the word that is law. The scene between the Christ and the woman at the well may likewise be found in the ritual. That is, here the woman is the lady with the long hair, that is Nun, the consort of Seth, and five husbands can be paired by her 5-star god born of Seth. Osiris drinks out of the well to take away his thirst. He also says, I am creating the water. I make way in the valley in the pool of the great one. Make road, that is the road maker, expresses what I am. I am the path by which they traverse out of the scepter of Osiris, end quote. So the Messiah reveals himself as a source of living water that springeth up unto everlasting life, end quote. Later on he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, end quote. I am creating the water, discriminately the seed, end quote, says Horus. Jesus says, the hour cometh when ye shall neither in this mountain nor yet in Jerusalem worship the Father, end quote. Jesus claims that this well of life was given to him by the Father. And the ritual says, he is thine, O Osiris. A well or a flow comes out of the mouth to him, end quote. Also, the paternal source is acknowledged in another text, quote, I am the Father, inundating when there is thirst, guarding the water. Behold me at it. Moreover, as in another chapter, the well of living water becomes the pool of peace. The speaker says, the well has come through me. I washed in the pool of peace, end quote. In Hebrews, the pool of peace is the pool of Salam, or Salom. And here, not only is the pool described at which the Horus filed are made pure and healed, not only does the angel of God, or God, descend to the waters, quote, the certain times are actually dated. The gods of the pure waters are there on the 4th hour of the night and the 8th hour of the day, saying, quote, pass away hence to him who has been cured. Epitome of a considerable portion of John's Gospel may be found in another chapter of the ritual. Quote, ye gods come to be my servants. I am the son of your Lord. Ye are mine through my Father who gave you to me. I have been among the servants of Hathor or Merit. I have been washed by thee, O attendant, end quote. Compare the washings of Jesus' feet by Mary. The Osiris exclaims, quote, I have welcomed the chief spirit in the service of the Lord of things. I am the Lord of the fields when they are white, end quote. For the reapers and the harvest, so the Christ now says to disciples, behold, I say unto you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields that are white already into the harvest, end quote. Then said he unto his disciples, the harvest truly is plenteous, but the laborers are few. Pray you therefore the Lord, the harvest of the soul, that he sent forth laborers into his harvest, and he called unto him his 12 disciples, end quote. Now, if we turn to the Egyptian, quote, book of Hades, end quote, the harvest, the Lord of the harvest, and the reapers of the harvest are all portrayed. The 12 are also there. In one scene, they are preceded by the god leaning on a staff, who is designated the Master of Joy, a surname of the Messiah Horus, when assimilated to the solar lunar Khonsu. The 12 are, quote, they who labored at the harvest in the plains of Neter Kar, end quote. A bearer of sickle shows the inscription. These are the reapers, end quote. The 12 are divided into two groups of 5 and 7. The original seven of the Adhen, Adahenu, the seven are the reapers. The other five are bending towards an enormous ear of corn, the image of the harvest ripe and ready for the sickles of those seven. The total 12 are called the, quote, happy ones. That is the bearer of food. Another of the 12 is the just one. Quote, the God says to the reapers, take your sickles, reap your grain, honor to you, reapers, end quote. Offerings are made to them on earth as bearers of sickles in the fields of Hades. On the other hand, offerings are made to them, on earth as bearer of sickles in the field of Hades. On the other hand, the tares or the wicked are to be cast out and destroyed forever. These 12 are the apostles in the Egyptian phase in the chapters on celestial diet. In the ritual, Osiris eats under the sycamore tree of Hathor. He says, quote, let him come from the earth. Thou hast brought these 7 loaves for me to live by, bringing the bread that Horus, that is Christ, makes. Thou hast eaten rations, and call to the gods for them, or the gods come with them to him. End quote. This is reproduced as miracle in the Gospels performed when the multitudes were fed upon 7 loaves. The 7 loaves are found here, together with the calling upon the gods or working the miracle of multiplying the bread. In the next chapter, there is a scene of eating and drinking. The speaker who impersonates the Lord says, I am the Lord of bread, Anu. My bread at the heaven was that of Ra. My bread on earth was that of Seb. End quote. The 7 loaves represents the bread of Ra. Elsewhere, the number prescribed to be set on one table as an offering is 5 loaves. These are also carried on the heads of 5 different persons, beings of underworld. 5 loaves are the bread of Seth. Thus, 5 loaves represent the bread of earth, and 7 the bread of heaven. Both 5 and 7 are sacred regulation numbers in the Egyptian ritual, and in the Gospel of Matthew, the miracles are wrought with 5 loaves in the one case and 7 in the other, when the multitudes are fed on celestial diet. This will explain the 2 different numbers in one and the same gospel miracle. In the canonic miracle, there is a lad with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. In the next chapter of the ritual, we possibly meet with the lad himself, as the miracle worker says, quote, I have given bread to the said youth, end quote. The Gnostics asserted truly that celestial persons and celestial scenes have been transferred to earth in our Gospels, and it is only within the planetarium, that is the heaven, or in the zodiac that we can at times identify the originals of both, and it is there we must look for the, quote, 2 fishes. As the latest form of the manifestor was in the heaven of the 12 signs that probably determined the number of 12 basketfuls of food remaining when the multitude had all been fed. Quote, they that ate the loaves were 5,000 men, and 5,000 was the exact number of the celestials or gods in the Assyrian paradise before the revolt and fall from heaven. The scene of the miracle of the loaves and fishes is followed by an attempt to take Jesus by force, but he withdraws himself, and this is succeeded by the miracle of his walking on the water and conquering the wind and waves. So it is in the ritual, that is chapter 57, that of the breath prevailing over the water in Hades. The speaker having to cross over says, oh, happen, let the Osiris prevail over the waters, like as the Osiris prevailed against the taking by stealth the night of the great struggle, end quote. The solar god was betrayed to his death by the Egyptian Judas on the, quote, night of the taking by stealth, which was the night of the Last Supper. The god is waylaid by the conspirators who have watched very much, end quote. They are said to smell him out, quote, by the eating of his bread, end quote. So the Christ is waylaid by Jesus, who, quote, knew the place, for Jesus often resorted thither, end quote, and by the Jews who have long watched to take him. The smelling of Osiris by the eating of his bread is remarkably rendered by John as the eating of the Last Supper. The ritual has it, quote, they smell Osiris by the eating of his bread, transporting the evil of Osiris, end quote. And when he had dipped the sop, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, and after the sop, Satan entered unto him, end quote. Then said Jesus to him, into whom the evil or devil had been transported, quote, that thou doest, do quickly, end quote. Osiris was the same, beseeching burial. Here it is demonstrable that the non-historical Herod is a form of Apophis, his serpent, called the enemy of the sun, S-U-N. In Syria, Herod is a red dragon. Herod in Hebrew signifies a terror, that is heru, is to terrify, and herot, e.g., is the snake, the typical reptile, the blood of the divine victim that is poured forth by the Apophis serpent in the at the sixth hour, on the night of smitten the profane, end quote. It literally shed by Herod as the Herod or typhonic serpent. So you see all these are not stories, these are stories, myths. We have taken these things literal, you see. The speaker in the ritual asks, who art thou, then, Lord of the silent body? I have come to see him who is the serpent, eye to eye and face to face, end quote. Lord of the silent body, quote, is a title of Osiris. Who art thou, then, Lord of the silent body, end quote, is asked and left unanswered. This character is also assigned to Christ. The high priest said unto him, quote, answer thou now nothing, end quote. But Jesus held his peace, end quote. Herod questioned him in many words, but he answered him nothing. He acts the prescribed character of, quote, Lord of the silent body, end quote, end quote. The transaction in the 6th hour of the night of the crucifixion is expressed explicitly in the gospel we read, quote, now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. The 6th hour being midnight, that shows that the solar nature of the mystery, which has been transferred to the 6th hour of the day in the gospel. It is in the 7th hour the mortal struggle takes place between Osiris and the deadly Apophis, or the great serpent, Haper, that is 450 cubits long, that fills the whole heaven with its vast enveloping folds. The name of the 7th hour is that, quote, which wounds the serpent, Haper, H-E-B-E-R, end quote. In this conflict with the evil power thus portrayed, the sun god is designated the, quote, the conqueror of the grave, and is said to make his advance through the influence of Isis, who aids him in repelling the serpent or devil or darkness. In the gospel, Christ is likewise set forth in the supreme struggle as, quote, conquering of the grave, end quote. For the graves were open, and many bodies of the saints which slept arose, end quote. And Mary represents Isis, the mother, and the cross is said of the great serpent, quote, there are those on earth who do not drink of the waters of the serpent, Haper, end quote, which may be parallel with the refusal of the Christ to drink of the vinegar mingled with gall. When the God has overcome the serpent, his all nightly annual and eternal enemy, he exclaims, quote, I come, I have made my way, I have come like the sun, through the gate of the one who likes to deceive and destroy, otherwise called the viper. I have made my way, I have bruised the serpent, I have passed, end quote. But the more express represented in the mysteries was that of the annual sun as the elder Horus Atom, as Julius Firmiscus says, in quote, in the solemn celebration of the mysteries, all things in order had to be done, which the youth either did or suffered in his death, end quote. Diodorus Siculus rightly identifies the, quote, the whole fable of the underworld, end quote. That was dramatized in Greece as having been copied, quote, from the ceremonies of the Egyptian funerals. And so brought on from Egypt into Greece and Rome, one part of this mystery was the portrayal of the suffering, quote, sun god, S-U-N, in a feminine phase, when the suffering sun, S-U-N, was ailing and ill, he became female, such being a primitive mode of expression. Luke describes the Lord in the Garden of Gethsemane as being in a great agony. Quote, and his sweat was, as it were, great drops of blood falling to the ground. End quote. This experience the Gnostics identify with the suffering of their own Hymnoria Sophia, whose passion is the original of that which is celebrated during Passion Week. The quote, weeping in Abtul, and which constitutes the fundamental mystery of the rosy cross and the rose of silence. In this agony and bloody sweat, the Christ simply fulfills the character of Osiris, Testes, the red sun, the sun god that suffers his agony and bloody sweat in Simon, whose Gethsemane or Gethsemane. Tesh means the bleeding, red, gory, separate, cut, and wounded. Tesh is the inert form of God whose suffering, like that of Adonias, was representing as feminine, which alone reaches a natural origin for the type, quote, he was also called Ansra, or the son bound up in linen. So natural were the primitive mysteries. My attention has just been called to the pastors in Lycopone who lived under Ptolemy, that is Philadelphia's, between 310 and 246 BC. And this Hercules is referred to as the, quote, that three-knighted lion, whom of old Triton's fierce dogs with furious jaw devour, within whose bowels, tearing of his liver, he rolled, burning with heat, through without fire, his head with drops of sweat bedewed all over. This describes the God's suffering, his agony and sweat, which is called the, quote, the bloody flux of Osiris. Here the nights are 3 in number, so the Son of Man was to be 3 nights as well as 3 days in the heart of the earth. In the Gospels, this prophecy is not fulfilled. But if we include the night of the bloody sweat, we have the necessary 3 nights. I've always wondered about that. I knew there was something wrong. Remember they were saying, I was like, wait a minute, that's 2 days, and that's 2.5 days. Anyway, and the Mithras become perfect. In this phase, the suffering son, S-U-N, was the red sun, whence the typical red line. As Atom, the red sun, is described as setting from the land of life and all the colors of crimson, or Pant, P-A-N-T, the red pool. This clothing of colors is represented as a gorgeous robe by Luke, a purple robe by Mark, and a robe of scarlet by Matthew. Interesting, as he goes down as the autumn equinox. These colors are key. Interesting. He is crucified, his mother, Nun or Merit, the heaven, seeing her son, the Lord of Terra, greatest of the terrible, setting from the land of life, with his hands drooping, she becomes obscure. There is a great darkness over all the land, as the crucifixion described by Matthew, in which the passing of the Lord of the terror is rendered by the terrible, quote, loud cry, the synoptic version. The sun god causes the deaf, or those in the earth, to live as he passes down into the underworld, because as he entered the earth, the tombs were open, figuratively though, but it is reproduced literally by Matthew. The death of Osiris is the ritual. It is followed by the night of the mystery of the great shapes, and is explained that the night of the great shapes was where they had been made the embalming of the body of Osiris. Quote, the good being justified forever, end quote. In the chapter on the night of the laying out, end quote, of the dead body of Osiris, is said that Isis rises on the night of the laying out of the dead body to lament over her brother Osiris, end quote. And again, another quote, the night of the laying out of the dead Osiris is mentioned, and again it is describes that on which Isis has risen to make a wail for her brother, end quote. But this is also the night on which he conquers his enemies and receives the birthplace of the gods. He tramples on the bandages that made for their burial. He raises his soul and conceals his body, end quote. So the Christ is found to have unwound the linen bandage of burial, and they saw the linen in one place and the napkin in another. He too conceals his body. This is closely reproduced or parallel in John's Gospel, where it is Mary Magdalene who rises in the night and comes to the sepulchre, quote, while it was yet dark, to find the Christ arisen as the conqueror of death and the grave. In John's version, after the body is embalmed in 100 pounds of weight of spice, consisting of myrrh and aloes, we have the night of the mystery of the shapes, end quote. For while it was yet dark, Mary Magdalene, coming to the sepulchre and peering in, sees the two angels in white sitting, the one at the head and the other at the feet, where the body had late lately lain, end quote. And in the chapter of how a living being is not destroyed in heaven, or the hour of the life ends not in Hades, end quote. There are two youthful gods, that is, two young youths of light, reveal as though who see the light, end quote. And Vignetta shows the deceased walking off, he has risen. Matthew has only one angel, or a splendid presence, whose appearance was as lightning, which agrees with Shepid, that is the splendid one, whose, quote, lights the sarcophagus, end quote, as a representative of the divinity. Ra, the risen Christ, who is first seen and recognized by Mary, says to her, quote, touch me not, for I am not yet ascended to my Father, end quote. The same scene is described by the Gnosis when Sophia rushes forward to embrace the Christ, who restrains her by exclaiming that he must not be touched. In the last chapter of the preservation of the body in Hades, quote, there's much mystery matter that looks plainer when written out in John's Gospel. It is said of the regenerated or risen God, quote, may the Osiris speak to thee, end quote. The Osirian does not know, he, that is Osiris, knows him, quote, let him not grasp him, end quote. The Osirified, quote, comes out sound, immortal is his name, end quote. He has passed along the upper roads, that is, in the risen spirit. Quote, he is in whose grasp with his hand and gives the papical proof of continual personality, as does the Christ, who says, quote, see my hands and my feet, that it is I myself, end quote. The sun god re-arises on the horizon, where he issues forth, saying to those who belong to his race, give me your arm, end quote. Says the Osirified deceased, I am made as you are, end quote. Let him explain it. As the reappearance of the Christ demonstrates that he is made as they are, see my hands and feet, that it is I myself, handle me and see. And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and feet. Then he said to Thomas, reach hither thy finger, and see my hands, and reach hither the hand, and put it into my side, end quote. These descriptions correspond to that of the cut, the wounded, and the bleeding sun god, who says to his companion, quote, give me your arm, I am made as you are, end quote. In the Gospel of the Hebrews, he is made to exclaim, quote, for I am not a bodiless ghost, but in the original, when the risen one says to his companions, quote, give me your arm, I am made as you are, end quote. He speaks as a spirit to spirit, whereas in the Gospels, the Christ has to demonstrate that he is not a spirit, because the scene has been transferable into the earth-like. The Gnostics truly declared that all the supernatural transitions asserted in the Christian gospel, end quote, were counterparts or representatives of what took place above. That is, they affirmed the history to be mythical, the celestial allegory made mundane, and they were in the right in the Egyptian gospel proves. There are healers, and Joshua ben Padirio may have been one, but because that is possible, we must not allow it to vouch for the impossible. Quote, thus, in the Gospels, the mythical is, and has to be, continually produced as miracle. That which naturally pertains to the character of the sun god becomes supernatural in appearance when brought down to earth. The solar god descended into the nether world, as the restorer of the bound to liberty, the dead to life. In this region, the miracles were wrought and the transformations took place. The evil spirits and destroying powers were exorcised from the mummies. The halt and the maimed were enabled to get up and go. The dead were raised, and a mouth was given to the dumb, and the blind were received. This reconstitution of the deceased is transferred to the earth life, whereupon the quote blind receive their sight and the lame walk. The lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, end quote, at the coming of the Christ to perform the miracles. The drama which the uh, idiotot mistook for human history was performed by the sun god in another world. I could keep on all day and all night or give a dozen lectures without exhausting my evidence that the canonic Gospels are only a later literalized reshope of the Egyptian writings, the representatives in the mysteries and the oral teachings of the Gnostics, which passed out of Egypt into Greece and Rome. But there is plenty more proof where this comes from. I can but only offer a specimen brick of that which elsewhere a building set 4 square and sound against every blast that blows. The Christian dispensation is believed to have been ushered in by the birth of a child and the portrayals of that child in the Roman catacombs at the child of Mary is the youthful sun god and the mummy image of the child king, the Egyptian carousel or Christ. The alleged facts of our Lord's life as Jesus the Christ were equally the alleged facts of our Lord's life as the Horus of Egypt, whose very name signifies the Lord. And I'm probably going to stop here. Well, I got only a few more pages. Let's just continue it all here. I'm just looking at it here. Where are we at? So the Christian legends were first relay of Horus Messiah, the solar hero, the greatest hero that ever lived in the mind of man, not in the flesh, the only hero to whom the miracles were natural because he was not human. From beginning to end, the history is not human but divine, and divine is the mythical. From the descent of the Holy Ghost to overshadow Mary to the ascension of the risen Christ at the end of 40 days, according to the drama of the pre-Christian mysteries. The subject matter, the characters, the occurrences, events, acts, and sayings here, the impress of the mythical mole, I should say, instead of the stamp of human history. Right through the ideas which shape the history were pre-ascent and are identifiable pre-Christian, and so we see the strange sight today in Europe of 100 million of pagan masquerading as Christians. Whether you believe it or not does not matter. The fatal fact remains that every trait and feature which go to make up the Christ as divinity and every event or circumstance taken to establish the human personality were pre-existent and pre-applied to the Egyptian and Gnostic Christ, who never could become flesh. The Jesus Christ with female paps, who is the Alpha and Omega of Revelation, was the Iu of Egypt and the Io of the Chaldeans. Jesus as the Lamb of God and Ithaca the fish was Egyptian. Jesus as the coming one, Jesus born of the Virgin Mother, who was overshadowed by the Holy Ghost. Jesus born of two mothers, born of whose names are Mary. Jesus born in the manger at Christmas and again at Easter. Jesus saluted by the three kings or magi. Jesus is the transfiguration of the mound. Jesus, whose symbol in the catacombs is the 8-ray star, the star of the east. Jesus as the eternal child. Jesus is God the Father, reborn as his own son. Jesus is the child of 12 years. Jesus anointed one of 30 years. Jesus in his baptism. Jesus walking on the water or working his miracles. Jesus as the caster out of demons. Jesus as the substitute who suffered in the vicarious atonement for sinful men. Jesus whose fathers are the two brethren, the 4 fishers, the 7 fishers, the 12 apostles, the 70 or 72 in some texts, whose names were written in heaven. Jesus who was administered to by 7 women. Jesus is his bloody sweat. Jesus betrayed by Judas. Jesus as conqueror of the grave. Jesus the resurrection and the life. Jesus before Herod in the Hades and in his reappearance to the women and to the 7 fishers. Jesus who was crucified both on the 14th and 15th of the month, Nisan. Jesus who was also crucified in Egypt as is written in the Revelation. Jesus as judge of the dead with the sheep on the right hand and the goats on the left. is Egyptian from first to last in every phase, from the beginning to the end. What Make whatever you can of Jehoshaphat ben Pandiro in some of the ancient Egyptian temples. The Christian iconoclasts, when tired of hacking and hooing in the symbolic figures incised in the chambers of imaginary and defacing the most prominent features of the monuments, found they could not dig out the hieroglyphs and took to covering them over with plaster or temper. And this plaster, intended to hide the meaning and stop the mouth of the stone word, has served to preserve the ancient writings as fresh as in hue and sharp in outline as when they were first cut and colored. In a similar manner, the temple of the ancient religion was invaded and possessions gradually gained by connivance of Roman power, and that enduring fortress, not built but quarried out of the solid rock, was stucco all over the front, and made white a while with its look of brand newness, and reopened under the sign of another name, that of the carnalized Christ. And all the time, each nook and corner were darkly alive with the presence and proofs of the earlier gods and the pre-Christian origins, even though the hieroglyphs remain unread until the time of Champollion. But stucco is not for lasting wear. It cracks and crumbles, sloughs off, and sinks away into its natal insignificance. The rock is the sole true foundation. The rock is the only record in which we can reach reality at last. Wilkinson, the Egyptologist, has actually said of Osiris on earth, quote, "Some may be disposed to think that the Egyptians, being aware of the promises of the real Savior, had anticipated that event, regarding it as though it had already happened, and introduced that mystery into their religious system." End quote. This is what obstinately term a false presentation, a birth feet foremost. We are also told by writers on the catacombs and the Christian iconographs that this figure is Osiris' type of Christ. This is Pan, Apollo, Aristus as a type of Christ. This is Harpocratius as a type of Christ. This is Mercury, but as a type of Christ. This is the devil. Quote, "For sun Mercury was the devil as a type of Christ, until long hearing of the facts reversed, perverted, and falsified makes one feel as if under a nightmare which has lasted for 18 centuries." Knowing the truth to have been buried alive and made dumb all that time, and believing that it had only to give voice and make itself heard to end the lying once for all, and bring down the curtain of oblivion as last upon the most pitiful drama of delusion ever witnessed on the human stage. And here the worst foes of the truth have ever been and still are the rationalizers of the mythos, such as the Unitarians. They have assumed the human history as the starting point and accepted it as the existence of a personal founder of Christianity as the one initiative and fundamental fact. They have done their very best to humanize their divinity of the mythos by discharging the supernatural and miraculous element in order that the narrative might be accepted as history. Thus, they have lost the battle from the beginning by fighting it on the wrong ground. The Christ is a popular lay figure that never lived, and a lay figure of pagan origin, a lay figure that was once the ram and afterwards the fish, a lay figure that is in human form was the portrait and image of a dozen different gods. The imagery of the category of the catacombs show that the types there represented are not the ideal figures of the human reality. They are the sole reality for 6 or 7 centuries after AD, because they have been so in the centuries long before. There is no man upon the cross in the catacombs of Rome for 700 years. The symbolism, the allegories, the figures, and types brought on by the Gnostics remain there just as they have been Romans, Greeks, Persians, and Egyptians. Yet the dummy idea of paganism is supposed to have become I mean, I'm sorry, has become doubtedly real as the God who was made flesh to save mankind from the impossible fall. Remember that the primary function, foundation stone for history in the New Testament is dependent upon the fall of man being in the fact of the old, whereas it was only a fable, which has its own mythical and unhistorical meaning. When we try over again that first step once taken in the dark, we find no foothold for us because there was no stair. The fall is absolutely non-historical, and consequently, the first bit of standing ground for an actual Christ the Redeemer is missing in the very beginning. And anyone who set up or was set up for a historical Savior from a non-historical fall can only be a historical impostor. But the Christ of the Gospels is not even that. He is in no sense a historical personage. It is impossible to establish the existence of a historical character, even as an impostor. For such as one, the two witnesses, the astronomical mythology and Gnosticism, completely proved an alibi forever. From the first supposed catastrophe to the final one, the figure of the celestial allegory were an ignoble mistake from matter of fact, and thus the Orthodox Christo later is left as last to climb to heaven with one foot resting on the ground of redemption that must be fallacious is a fraud founded on a fable. Every time the Christian turns to the east to bow his obeisance to the Christ, it is confession that the cult is solar, the omission being all the more fatal because it is unconscious. Every person of the Christ with the halo of glory and the accompanying cross of the equinox prophets proof. The Christian doctrine of resurrection furnished evidence absolutely conclusive of the astronomical and chronicle nature of the origins. This is to occur, as it always did, as the end of the cycle or the end of the world. Christian revelation knows nothing of immortality except in the form of periodical renewal dependent on the coming one, end quote. And the resurrection of the dead still depends on the day of judgment and the last day and the end of the world, end quote. They have no other world. Their only other world is at the end of this. Now there is no fools living who would be fools big enough to cross the Atlantic Ocean in a bark so rotten and unseaworthy as this, is which they hope to cross the dark river of death, and on a pier of cloud he landed safe in heaven. The Christian theology was responsible for substituting faith instead of knowledge, and the European mind is only just beginning to recover from the mental paralysis. Okay, hold on a second here. Okay, let me finish this thing up. Okay. Let's see, where was I at? Uh, Now there are no fools living into living who would be fools big enough to cross the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, I've said that. The Christian religion is responsible for enthroning the cross of death in heaven with a deity on it, doing public penance for a private failure in the commencement of creation. It has taught men to believe that the vilest spirit may be washed white in the atoning blood of the purest offered up as a bribe to a avenging God. It has divinized a figure of helpless human suffering in the face of pitiful pain, as if there were not but a great heartache at the core of all things, or the vast infinite were but as veiled and sad eye sorrow that brings visibly to birth on in the miseries of human life. But in the old pagan world, men deified the beautiful, the glad, end quote, as they will again upon a loftier pedestal when the fable of this fictitious fall of man and false redemption by the cloud begotten God has passed away like a phantasm of the night, and men awake to learn that they are here to wage ceaseless war upon sordid sufferings, remedied wrong, and preventative pain, here to put an end to them, not to apothesize the efficiency of sorrow to be adored as a type of eternity. The most beneficial and the most beautiful, the happiest or the healthiest, the most godlike is most glad. The Christian cult has fanatically fought for its false theory and waged incessant warfare against nature and evolution. Nature intentions made somewhat visible, and against some of the noblest instincts during 18 centuries. Seas of human blood have been spilled to keep the bark of Peter afloat. Earth has been honeycombed with the graves of the martyrs of free thought. Heaven has been filled with a horror of a great darkness in the name of God. 18 centuries are a long while and a long time of a lie, but a brief span in the eternity of truth. The fiction is sure to be found out, and the lie will fall at last, at last, at last. No matter though it towers to the sky and darkens earth, you cannot make the lie immortal. Though stupendously enshrined by art in every perfect mold and mind, Angelo, Raphael, Milton, Handel, all its pillars cannot stay it from the fall. The pyramid of impostori reared by Rome, all the cement for eternity home, must crumble back to earth, and every gust shall revel in the desert of this dust. And when the prison of immortal mind hath fallen to set forth the bound and blind, no more shall life be one long dread of death. Humanity shall breathe with ampler breath, expand in spirit, and in stature rise, to match his birthplace of the earth and skies. So that is the end of this particular one tonight, and I'm going to end it. That is, again, from Gerald Massey's work. Thank you for being here. I had no idea it was going to be this long, but it's concluded. So thank you for being here, and appreciate you being attentive. And so we'll say goodnight tonight, and you take care, and we'll talk again.